Good afternoon to you and welcome to our final live stream from the World Economic Forum Africa meeting here in Durban. You can probably see some of the clearing up going on behind me, but earlier today the Deputy President, Cyril Ramaphosa, giving a closing address talking about the importance of good leadership. Maybe he was throwing shade, maybe he wasn't. Hard to know at this stage. And he actually came out and took some questions as well and seemed to enlarge upon the theme, so maybe it was a little bit of shade being thrown. Also, across the road today, President Jacob Zuma doing a walkabout at the Durban Exhibition Centre. But let's get a taste of flavour, a wrap-up, if you like, of what the last few days have been like here from the World Economic Forum Africa meeting in Durban. And to discuss it with me, Aisha Pandor is the founder and CEO of SweepSouth. It's one of those new companies, I suppose the obvious analogy is Uber, but it's Uber for home cleaning. And with her today, Nhlamu Dlomu, an executive member of the board of the auditing firm KPMG. Thank you both very much indeed for joining me.
Thanks for having us.
Nhlamu, let me start with you. There's been a lot of talk over the last few days. There's been discussion about inclusive growth. There's been that phrase that everyone gets so scared of, radical economic transformation. Do you think this has damaged Team South Africa in any way?
No, in actual fact, I don't think it's damaged Team South Africa. I think what has been useful is to talk about inclusive growth and focus on that rather than the term radical economic transformation. I think inclusivity has been defined as including people who are actually on the margins of economic participation. Now, when you think of people on the margins, you're thinking of the youth, you're thinking of the unemployed. We all carry high numbers of unemployed youth specifically. So it's been quite encouraging to know that we're now defining inclusivity in a different way. And I guess the challenge now is to make it come alive.
That's a huge challenge. I mean, there's always been this idea, and the Deputy President put it quite well when he said, I think we all know what needs to be done. I don't know if that's true. I don't know if everyone agrees on what needs to be done, but he talks about deliverables. He suggested that this time next year, at the next forum, we should be able to say, this is what's being done. I don't quite get a sense that that's what's going to happen.
The question around action that's going to be taken has come up a lot, and I think it was well summed up by the Deputy President. But when I look at it and listen to all the talk about leadership, we had the terms responsible and responsive leadership. I like the responsive element of it because what it suggests to me is that we are expecting action. And actually, action means you have to have something that's measurable, something that you can track, and somebody who's responsible for it. Now, my hope is that we will move away from always focusing on the 2063 goals, 2030 goals, to focusing on the next 12 months, the next 2 years, and have things that are practical and actionable. So I'm looking forward to seeing something like that, and that's when we would start seeing something different at the next WEF meeting.
Aisha, let me bring you in here. I mean, in a way, your app is technically a lot like Uber in that it basically uses technology that wasn't available 5, certainly 10 years ago. But Uber started in San Francisco for a reason. It started because the market was there and the infrastructure was there. You probably didn't have those two advantages.
So yes and no. So no in the sense that we didn't necessarily have the ecosystem that would facilitate that sort of thing. But yes, our idea deals with domestic workers. There are many domestic workers in South Africa. We certainly had the example of Uber as something to use when it came to the technology and how we would design it. And we've seen a lot of progress. So our company is just under 3 years old. When we launched it in late 2014, we had to ask the very real question about whether we had to build buying phones for domestic workers who join our platform into our financial model. Now that's not even a question anymore. People who come and apply to our platform have phones because they use WhatsApp, they use Facebook. So yes, there are issues around infrastructure, but we have examples that we can use and tailor to our own circumstances. And then technology innovation, it moves regardless of whatever's happening. And if you're part of that trend and you're moving with that trend, then things happen.
Every phone is always cheaper.
Exactly, yeah. No, we've seen, those phones reduced in cost to, I think, about a third of what they cost 3 years ago, and then being very accessible. So, yeah.
Is there anything that policymakers can do to speed that up? I mean, is there anything that could be done if you were in charge? What would you do?
So, I mean, I think one of the things to do is to recognize that When it comes to a lot of these things, innovation, when it comes to inclusivity, there's a need to step back a little bit as well and just let things take their course and be responsive to changes that are happening. And then to also take a role where you're supporting and facilitating rather than dictating how things should be done. So I was quite encouraged. I sat in a session where we talked about financial inclusion and the role that kind of digitalization can play when it comes to people having access to financial instruments. And you know, I sat on a panel as a young entrepreneur with bank CEOs and with executives at, you know, one of South Africa's top telco companies, and they were really listening to what we had to say when it came to how to make access to financial instruments, to, you know, using mobile phones, etc., easier for entrepreneurs and also for the people who are entrepreneurs' customers.
In a way, I mean, I'm thinking of there are various companies in Johannesburg, they're in Cape Town, I think there's some in Durban now who've been rolling out fibre in the, you know, the more expensive suburbs. You must watch that kind of thing really closely, because more people spend more time online. They don't need fibre to access your product, but because they spend more time online, they're more likely to.
Yeah, absolutely. So another question about 3 years ago was whether there'd be enough South Africans who would be able to and want to transact online, who would become potential customers of something like SweepSouth. Again, with access to fibre, with people using mobile phones, that's a lot less of a question now. What I'm more interested in, though, is how do we get connectivity to grassroots levels? So domestic workers, people who use taxis to get to work every day, how are those people having access to data, to the internet through their phones, and how are they able to do it in a very low-cost way?
I had a conversation, he was sitting in the chair you're in now, with Siyabonga Cwele, the Minister of Telecommunications and Postal Services, earlier this week. And I mean, there is something that's really happened is municipal Wi-Fi. Yeah. If you had said to me 10 years ago, South African municipalities would say, I'd say you've crossed the line between fantasy and science fiction. And yet it's actually happening.
Yeah, the city of Tshwane is a great example of that. And so I think, you know, as a young person who's running a business, I'm also very positive about changes that I've seen in South Africa, and that for me is a good example of how private companies can work together with municipalities to bring things like that to reality.
Nhlamu, I mean, when you've been watching these debates, do you think it's going to be easier for the next Aisha in 4 years' time? Do you think there's anything that's been coming from these discussions, from the leaders that we've seen, who are actually going to do something that will make it easier for the next person?
Definitely. I think it's definitely in the conscience, and people now are more conscious of it than they've ever been. So you're thinking about it, you've had the actual business owners, the entrepreneurs talking about it. It's very different from reading about it or hearing about it as a story that's being told elsewhere. So certainly I can see that there's a desire to change that. And what you're talking about is ecosystems that are required for entrepreneurship and innovation to thrive. We're quite well known for using a lot of voice and very little data, especially the market that you're targeting. So the question is, how do governments and businesses create more opportunities for people to access the internet and to access data and to be able to transact using digital platforms?
When you've been watching the debates this week, I mean, is there one issue in particular that you think might be the most important, or one that you think might be being missed? I mean, is there are lots of discussions about the economy and how to grow the economy. All of these things require mandates from voters, in democracies at least, and I sometimes wonder if that issue of how complicated that can be to do sometimes gets missed a little.
You know, I think the one issue that hasn't been raised is how do we digitize responsibly? So we're talking about a continent where there's high unemployment rates. We're talking about digitizing, and the question gets asked, a lot of jobs will be automated. What does this mean for the petrol attendant? In South Africa, we still have one of those industries where we use physical labor. So this question of digital labor and what it will mean for South Africa and what doing it responsibly looks like is something that the government should be looking at setting a policy for. And already you can tell from reports that a number of countries, developed countries, are having the debate of what it means for social welfare, what it means for jobs. Is it really going to have an impact, and how quickly it will have an impact? I think we need to choose for ourselves as a continent what would make sense in terms of job creation.
I mean, other countries are battling with that. I mean, it's you know, the Trump effect is precisely because of that. I can't see an easy solution. You come up with these things. Have you got an easy solution?
No, I mean, I think it is difficult, it's complex, but what you've also got to look at is enabling people to continue to provide value in a changing landscape. So, you know, automating and jobs being automated is probably a reality, but then how do we get that petrol attendant to be able to do something else and to have the means to do something that includes digital? So I think that's more the question, and unfortunately, you know, these things, they take a long time where everyone's talking about it and then suddenly it happens and you're in a situation where, oh no, you know, now people are losing jobs. So I think it's positive that we're talking about it now. But, you know, we need to take action. It needs to be a 12-month, not a, you know, 5-year or 10-year landscape that we're talking about.
I suppose it's about the petrol attendant having access to free quality Wi-Fi for an hour afterwards every day so that he can do some studying. Aisha, your main takeaway from the last week, I mean, there'll be another World Economic Africa Forum in a year's time in 2018. Is there anything that strikes you that you'll still be thinking about and talking about in a year's time?
So I think, you know, I've been encouraged by the focus on youth and the understanding that there's a lot of power in leading youth responsibly and hearing the youth voice when it comes to changes that need to take place on the continent. I liked both the Deputy President and Professor Schwab spoke about the responsibility to be custodians for youth and to realize that, you know, this is a young continent and their role is really to hand over an Africa that is healthy to youth. So I was really encouraged by that. I think what I would like to see is, you know, is more private company recognition that youth need to be involved in these things. And I think the relationships that started something like this need to result in something that can be demonstrated at, you know, at next year's conference, for example. So, you know, I've sat and had conversations with CEOs of big companies. We had Microsoft reach out to us yesterday and talk about how that could help. What I'd like to see is that not resulting in a kind of a dead conversation and meeting a year later and saying, oh, yeah, you know, we really should meet up and chat, but that actually resulting in something that we can show in a year's time.
So you want them to say, oh no, not you again.
No, I don't want them to
They've
say
seen
that.
you so much. Nhlamu, a final thought from you. I mean, what for you are you still going to be thinking about in a year's time?
I'll be thinking about how to enhance collaboration and alliances and people working together. Because what was sobering, the word sobering was mentioned right at the end today, was that because of slow economic growth, where we were used to healthier numbers, and Klaus Schwab actually mentioned that this will continue most likely for the next foreseeable future. We need to get creative in terms of changing our business models. So more entrepreneurs, more youth participation, and actually the big business and the government providing an opportunity for those to thrive by collaborating and not always thinking of working models as having people in a big company, rather incubating, innovating, looking after these businesses and actually making the ecosystem, the landscape manageable, because the debate that Aisha was having earlier on was actually quite interesting to hear how the struggles of entrepreneurs in all these countries. We talk about it all the time, but how do we enable it through the right policies, simplifying things and not becoming too bureaucratic, making it easy for someone with a creative idea to thrive. So I think that will stay with me, and that's something that I'm looking forward to hearing more about.
Simplicity, sometimes it really is key. Well, Aisha Pandor, the CEO and founder of SweepSouth, thank you so much. Nhlamu Dlomu, executive member of the board of KPMG, thank you. I really appreciate the time.
An absolute pleasure. Thanks.
Well, thank you for being with us. We'll be back with you soon, hopefully at the next World Economic Forum meeting. There is a lot more coverage, of course, comments from the Deputy President, comments from the President himself, comments from all sorts of people at our portal at ewn.co.za. Thanks for being with us.